Good morning. How is everybody? Yeah. Well, I just warned you, Suzanne went to see her grandbaby, so y'all watch out. There's pictures around. I went to see my son. No. I went to see the grandbaby. Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right. Went to see the grandbaby. So went Friday night or Friday evening. Spent the night Friday night, came back yesterday evening. So got back at 7:30. Got to have a few Easter eggs with her. And all the good qualities that she has, she inherited from me. Listen, she's getting bossy and she thinks she runs the house, and she's sweet. But anyway, any announcements that we need to make? All right, open your Bibles to Acts 2. That's where we are today. Acts 2. We'll start there. Acts 1, we established really the outline for the book of Acts. Talked about who the major characters were, time of writing, the period of time. Jesus has, in chapter 1, Jesus ascends into heaven. And so he has left planet Earth, if you will, and he is in heaven above. Acts chapter 2, in the day of Pentecost. The day of Pentecost was 50 days, 50, Penta meaning 50 days after the Passover. You can find out if you want to read more about it. It's found in Leviticus chapter 23. It is Pentecost was also called the Feast of Gatherings, or you also will read occasionally folks refer to it as Feast of First Fruits. It's when the ingathering, it's springtime. It's when the fruits or the crops, there's the word, the crops began to come in. And so you have that time frame. And it is Pentecost when we talk about Acts 2, we talk about the early church, and we talk about the importance of the early church. One of the things, not today, but I want us to talk about as we go through this book of Acts, and we want to do it in a reasonable fashion and speed, is to talk about the importance of restoring the church and why that's important, why we as a fellowship, why we talk about restoring the church. But we've got to get the church established first, and that's what happens in Acts chapter 2. Jesus had promised before he left this earth, from the standpoint before he was crucified, Jesus had promised that the church would come, that his church would be a reality. And he also promised that that he would not leave the people comfortless, that he would send the Holy Spirit that would come after him. And in Acts chapter 2, we see that coming of the Spirit upon certain of those that were there. And thus the beginning of the church. So let's talk about it. Let's read along with me. It's when the day of Pentecost had fully come, they were all with one accord. All means apostles. It doesn't just mean everybody, not everybody, but just the apostles. When they were all with one accord in one place, and suddenly there came a sound from heaven as of a rushing mighty wind, and it filled the whole house where they were sitting. Then there appeared to them divided tongues as of fire, and one sat upon each of them. And they were all filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak with other tongues as the Spirit gave them utterance. This is a sight to behold. And really, there's not a lot to add to it. And sometimes we say, well, I don't understand the scene. Well, I have problems as well grasping the scene because we've never seen anything like this. But if you capture what's going on, just think about the great sound. Verse 2, the sound of heaven, a rushing mighty wind. You've stood outside probably in the last few days, and you've been around these days where the wind gushes up to 60 miles an hour and you've heard it. Well, imagine that, but just imagine it a constant roar. I was thinking when Friday night as we were at Ethan and Kara's and Graceland's house, they have for Graceland have ever since she came to this world. This was something that was important to my son. Like a lot of babies, they do now the sound machines, and hers is a constant kind of a white noise, if you will. And we close the door. It's disturbing. But for her, it drowns out all the outside noise. You know, she can't hear anything. You can talk in the house. You can run the vacuum cleaner. She couldn't hear it for what's noise in her room. Well, that constant noise. And so you have this, all of a sudden you have this wind and you have this appearance of the divided tongues that's sitting upon each of the apostles. And notice that it says they spoke in other tongues. Well, languages. They spoke in other languages. This is a miraculous event, to say the least, to speak in a language which you've never studied. How do you do that? I can't do it. I can't speak in a tongue that I've never studied, a language that I've never studied before. And yet they were able to in the first century, in the day of Pentecost. They were dwelling, verse 5, in Jerusalem, devout men from every nation under heaven. And when this sound occurred, excuse me, then the multitude came together and were confused because everyone heard them speak in his own language. Now, you get a sense that they're talking about the Mediterranean world. In other words, the folks that were there heard them speak in their language. It's not that they spoke in every language that was upon the earth at that time, but those that were there, they got to hear, and they heard the message in their own language. Now, think about the impact that would make, and it would make upon you. Here you are, you're gathered together, and maybe you know, let's say 2 languages. Let's say you know, we'll just pull one out of there. You know French and you know English. But your native tongue is say French. And for the most part, you're hearing English all the time, and all of a sudden you begin to hear your native French language. The impact that would have upon you. You say, well, I understand the English, roughly, but I really understand my native tongue. Yes. Well, who wouldn't? Well, these folks heard in their native tongue. And they were all amazed, verse 7, marveled, saying to one another, look, are not all these who speak Galileans? In other words, these folks don't talk this language. Now, English is English. Yes, I know. There's the English of the South, and there's the English of the North, and there's the redneck English, which I use, and there's different, if you will. There's a difference even in the English language to a degree, but we still all understand. We still all use the same words. We use them a little differently, or our brogue's a little different, or we chop them off. I have a tendency to chop words off. And I also have a tendency to be lazy at the end of a word and not fully enunciate all the way through. I know that. And I catch myself, and I try to correct that. I've been taught better, but I just don't always do better. It's due to probably a lazy tongue. Well, these folks, they hear, and they're amazed, and they marvel. And they say, look, these folks, they don't speak this language. How is it, verse 8, that we hear each in our own language in which we were born? You see, this is their native tongue. How do we hear our native tongue? And then they list the Parthians and the Medes and the Elamites, those dwelling in Mesopotamia, Judea, Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt, and the parts of Libya adjoining Cyrene visitors from Rome, both Jews and proselytes, Cretans and Arabs. We hear them speaking in our own languages the wonderful works of God. So they were all amazed and perplexed, saying to one another, whatever could this mean? But others, you might say others of a different character, of a different mindset, mockingly said, they are full of new wine. Now, let's think about this for just a second. You have two different personalities based upon really the differences of people. You had, first of all, those that were beginning to hear in their native tongues, and they're amazed and they're astonished because these folks that are talking, they're Galileans and they don't know our language. How in the world are they able to talk in our language? They are amazed. But even within the same group of people that are hearing, there's another group. They have a different mindset, a different, if you will, different ideas. They begin to mock. Well, these folks, they're just full of new wine, which is interesting because new wine is just grape juice. You don't, open you up a bottle of Welch's and you won't get drunk. Well, that's what they're saying here. They're full of new wine. So even their charge is a little bit off, if you will. But there is this scene, and it impresses some, and it doesn't impress others. Right there tells you something. Here's what it simply tells you. It tells you that when the gospel is presented, some will listen and some won't. And there's various reasons why those that won't. I mean, it's not the same for everybody. There's not a one stamp idea reason that you can put and say, this is the reason people won't listen. There's a lot of different reasons. But notice the difference. Something anybody like to say or add before we get into Peter's sermon? Don't know. Doesn't say. It sort of limits itself to those that were there, but most of their work, because people, this was one of those that some folks would come to the Passover and then they'd stay for Pentecost. You're talking about 50 days from Passover, so you're talking about a month and a half, 6 weeks. And so you have, well, 7 actually, but you have a period of time there where not everybody stayed. Some would come for Pentecost, but you wanted folks, and that was the purpose of wanting folks to hear. So there were folks in and out. And so I don't really know. I think it's a good question, just don't know the answer. Anything else? In other words, as it lists the people, I'm just looking down at verse 9. You have the Parthians and the Medes and the Elamites. Could they all understand each other? They were all in the Mediterranean area, so I would venture to say there were probably dialects of them, so you probably could understand enough of it. But as we get into it, it seems as if there were groups, and the Elamites were over here, and the Parthians were over here, and they heard in their own language. Because if you look, I didn't even think this time stop and count. Parthians, Medes, Elamites, Mesopotamia, Judea, Cappadocia, Pontus, Asia, Phrygia, Pamphylia, Egypt, parts of Libya, Cyrene, visitors from Rome, both Jews, proselytes, Cretans, Arabs. So you have about 16 there. You only have 12 apostles. So you have some of these admittedly are dialects. They're not off. They're sort of like what we would classify Southern and Northern talk. So, good question. Anything else? Oh, I was afraid somebody'd ask that. No, 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 no. I don't know the answer to that. I want to assume yes, because the temple was really, really bigger than what we think of the temple, but the temple was large. I've always pictured it, in my opinion, as being in that area. Right, not in the house. Yeah, that's why I've always pictured it in the temple, as opposed to the marketplace. I think that would be the other option, the temple or the marketplace. But yes, yes, there would have been Jews at the temple, but the statement in verse 1 prohibits me from saying definitively where they were. Look what it says. They were all with one accord in one place, but it doesn't tell me where the place is. I would assume, because like I say, the temple was far. It wasn't. We picture it like this. Why? Because we've always seen it on the backs, in the backs of our Bibles, and the temple was large. It would accommodate this number of people. So and like you said, Passover and Pentecost were one of the major feasts. You had to go. Jewish individuals usually made pilgrimage to Jerusalem, and these were two of the major feasts. They had to go then to Jerusalem, and so you would have had these folks. And so I've always pictured the temple, but um, I'm not going to say definitively. If you don't want to picture it there, okay, but I'm with you. I don't. It couldn't have been in a house. Anything else? Yeah, yeah. Okay. All right. All right. Yeah, because here is the point, and that could help that theory. And I'm not saying that it's true, but if you look at verse 1, and it says when they were all with one accord, and we have to ask who is the all, and that has always, or not always, but that has been a question through the years. And when you get to the they, the pronoun, you have to say, well, who's the they? Well, in English, you always go and find up above where you find a pronoun. You go, uh, we'll not get into antecedents and all that, all those fancy words that teachers make you use, but you go find the nearest noun, and you go back, and verse 26, the last verse of the first chapter, notice what it says. They cast their lots, and the lot fell upon Matthias, and he was numbered with the 11 apostles. When the day of Pentecost had fully come, well, who have they been talking about just then? The apostles. So the they of chapter 2, verse 1 is the apostles. And so it could have been that they had been somewhere else and walked over to the temple. But the they in verse 1 is the apostles. There were 120 men, but those were not the ones. This is a completely different movement. Yes, yeah, that's we covered that when we talked about it last week. Anything else? Well, beginning in verse 14, we have Peter standing up, and we have Peter's account of, or we have the account of Peter's sermon. Now, here, let me just throw out some questions, thoughts that people have had through the years and have proposed in different writings and things. Why don't we have the other apostles' sermon? Well, probably because they all preach the same thing. Second of all, we have Peter because that really, if you think about it from beginning really at this point and going through the 10th to the 11th chapter, as we talked about last week, we have Peter as sort of the main character in the New Testament church, early church. And then we flip over to Paul. Those are the two main people that Luke talks about in this book. So that could be an answer. Then you have, okay, so is this Peter's full sermon? Don't know. It is complete in what he says. But then you say, well, Peter didn't preach for an hour and a half, 2 hours. Well, he did it other times. He did it other times. It would, like say, it sounds complete. It could have been complete. It may not be complete. It is complete in that it is all we need. It is what God has given to us. And so God has said, this is all you need. And so this is all we need. He begins by talking about prophecy. He then, if you will, transitions into talking about Jesus, which then he transitions into talking about what they had done to Jesus. And then, interestingly enough, there is an audience response in the midst of a sermon. What shall we do? What can we do? And then Peter concludes, as we have his sermon, by telling them what to do. Any questions before we jump into it? All right, verse 14. Peter, standing up with the 11, raised his voice and said to them, Men of Judea and all who dwell in Jerusalem, let this be known to you and heed my words. In other words, listen up. For these are not drunk, as you suppose. Remember, that was part of the charge. These are not drunk, as you suppose, since it's only the third hour of the day. Now, they accuse them of being drunk on new wine, which, like I say, that's grape juice, which is an impossibility. But not only that, but Peter says, look, it's only 9 o'clock in the morning. Third hour of the day, 9 o'clock in the morning. He says, they can't be drunk. Don't have time. And so then he begins. He says, but that which was spoken by the prophet Joel, and this comes out of Joel chapter 2, beginning about verse 28 in there, and goes then following. But he begins to talk about a revelation that God had given. And if you go back to Joel 2 and put yourself, if you will, if you go back to Joel 2 and you put yourself in Joel 2, you understand that Joel is revealing to the children of Israel something that is going to happen, that hadn't happened, and didn't happen right then, but is going to happen. And so Peter reminds these folks, you remember what the prophet Joel said, what the revelation that God had given to them. What was it? That it shall come to pass in the last days, says God. Well, when are the last days? Well, if we took the time to look at Isaiah 2, and then look at 2 Timothy chapter 4, or 3, well, yeah, 3 and 4, but 3, and then look at Hebrews chapter 1, we find out that the last days are the Christian age, the Christian dispensation, the Christian time, the time from the cross on. And so he says in the last days. Now, here's the point. If folks understood, and here's really what Peter's saying is going to say, in essence, we're in the last days. But the people understood, if nothing else, Isaiah 2. In the days of these kings, God will establish a kingdom, and it should not be destroyed. In the mountaintops, in Jerusalem, Zion, he calls it, in Jerusalem. That Isaiah had prophesied. Isaiah prophesied to the day, the time, the place. This is the fulfillment. But Peter takes, instead of Isaiah 2, interestingly enough, takes Joel 2 and says, remember what Joel said. And he's going to say, this is what's happening. Well, what all did Joel say? Well, he gives an account, not of all that Joel says, but he says of some things. Talking about God, God says, I'll pour out my spirit on all flesh. All flesh here is probably something that stands for a part that stands for a whole. In other words, just a little piece, but it stands for all. God's going to pour out his spirit upon all flesh, Jew and Gentile. Your sons and your daughters will prophesy. A little bit when we get into Acts, towards the end of Acts, we're going to see some of this. And so we're going to hold off on talking about that till then. Your young men shall see visions. Your old men shall dream dreams. And on my men servants and on my maid servants, I'll pour out my spirit in those days, and they'll prophesy. They're going to be those that are going to speak. The word prophesy, just literally means to speak forth, to speak for another, to speak forth. And so the Greek is the word prophetes. There's actually then, three words basically that are Hebrew words used in the Old Testament that have the idea of speaking for another. And so, but he's predicting, he says, I'm going to pour out my spirit. There's going to be those that are going to talk about, testify, preach, speak for. And then he says, verse 19, I'll show wonders in heaven above and signs in the earth beneath, blood and fire and vapor and smoke. And you might say, well, when's all of the blood and fire and vapor and smoke? He's just talking about, here's some dynamic things that are about to happen. The sun shall be turned to darkness. The type of literature that's used right here, you also find in the book of Ezekiel, and it's talking about, it's used in Ezekiel, especially with the end of something, and so he's talking about here the end of something. We'll just leave it at that at this point in time. He says, the sun will be turned to darkness, moon into blood, before the coming of the great and awesome day of the Lord. And it shall come to pass that whoever calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved. He gives then a provision for salvation. Now, Peter's sermon, as we have the whole revelation, not just of Peter's sermon, but say all of the New Testament, we see then in fulfillment all of these things that Peter is talking about in Acts 2. And you might say, well, by faith, these folks are having to accept all this. And the answer is yes. But as he talks about basically, okay, my spirit's going to come. There's going to be tremendous things done. There's going to be the end of something. I believe that he's probably having reference here in verses 20 and 21 to the end of the Jewish system. There's going to become an end to something. Well, what is it? Well, it's Jewish law, Jewish system, Jewish way. And he says, before the coming of the great and awesome day of the Lord. And it's going to come to pass. And he says, but whoever will call upon the name of the Lord, whoever's going to follow the Lord, whoever does what the Lord tells him to do, salvation is offered. Now, imagine, if you will, put yourself, and it's interesting to go back and read any account of the gospel or of the Bible, and to put yourself in different positions, different places, different roles. Put yourself in the position for a minute, not of Peter, but put yourself in the position of a person that's listening. You've seen the tongues of fire. You've heard the rushing wind. You see these men and hear these men speaking in languages that they've never studied. And you all of a sudden you hear this sermon in your own tongue, your own language. And notice that the first thing they tell you is that God has given a revelation, and you might say, I remember Mama talking about that. I remember playing at Grandma's one day, and I remember her talking about that. I've even heard it read. And I remember this being attributed to Joel and being read by someone after Joel's time. And they're thinking, okay, there's a change in the guard coming. My people were offered salvation. Will I still be offered salvation? And here's the affirmation in verse 21. Yes. Anything else before we get in? He makes a change here into talking really about Jesus, but anything about this anybody like to say or ask? Okay, so he begins then in verse 22, men of Israel, hear these words, Jesus of Nazareth, a man attested by God to you. Now, let's just stop right there. He says, you need to listen. You need to hear. Well, what is it you're going to hear? You need to hear about Jesus of Nazareth. Now think about this. It hasn't been many days before that Jesus was crucified. Pentecost is Jesus was crucified Passover time, and like I say, Pentecost is 50 days after the Passover. So this is still they're still buzzing all through Jerusalem about. Do you remember that Jesus was crucified and there were two thieves that were crucified on either side of him? Do you remember all of this? And people, that's still the town gossip, and that's the town talk. And the Jews are reveling in their defeat of a false teacher. And the followers are still, they know that they've heard of the resurrection, and they've heard and know of the ascension of Jesus, and they're waiting on him to come back. And so you have this mix. But now all of a sudden you have all of these people hearing this. Okay, but do you know about Jesus of Nazareth? Now, Peter's going to help them along in their story. He says he's a man. That's important. We do not think about this enough. He was a man. He ate, he slept, he drank, he hurt. He had pain, he had agony, he had mental anguish and pain and agony. He had physical pain and agony and anguish. He had trouble with people, but he also had kindness and compassion and love for people. He stopped and he talked to people. He taught people. He had people reject him. He had people receive him. But he had all of those feelings that went on. He was a man, flesh and blood. But he was a man attested by God. The word attested is the idea of proved, demonstrated, accredited to. He was approved by God. To you by, and then he says, here's how we know he was the Messiah. Yes, a man, but the Messiah. He was approved to you by God by what? Well, by miracles. Jesus may have done more, but we have about 40 miracles, 40 examples of miracles that Jesus did in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Now, he may have done more, but we have about 40 examples. Wonders. Wonders is almost the effect of what you saw. In other words, people wondered at what they saw. And signs. Well, of course, the signs that he did, they were supernatural, but they demonstrated a power of God. Signs and wonders, which God did through him in your midst. It's interesting. Think about who he attributes the power to. It's not to say that Jesus was not powerful. I don't mean to say that, but I want you to understand who he attributes the power to. He attributes it to the Father. God did all these things through Christ. And notice what he says. He says, as you yourselves also know. Well, how did they know it? Observation. How do you know things? Well, you read things, you see things, you hear things, right? Well, they had seen, they had heard, they understood. They knew, yeah. They knew about these things. They knew about the miracles. They knew about what he had done. They knew about how he had impressed upon others. And so Peter says, you knew these things. And then verse 23, him, Jesus, being delivered by the determined purpose and foreknowledge of God. In other words, God knew about this before it ever happened. We've talked about before the foreknowledge of God, God knowing beforehand, God knowing what was going on. God knew this before it actually happened. You, though, he says, have taken by lawless hands and crucified and put to death. the Romans didn't have a law given to them by God. And when you go, and we're going to talk some about not this exact point, but the story here in the sermon this morning. But you have to understand the Jewish folks couldn't crucify people. They couldn't put people to death. And so that's why Jesus was sent then to Pilate. While you say, well, they had a law, but yes, but remember Rome was in charge then, and Rome had pretty much taken their law, if you will, away from them. They couldn't put people to death. They could have trials, but they couldn't put people to death. That was Rome's responsibility, and Rome was good at it, unfortunately. But Rome was good, had crafted the art of crucifixion. They had perfected it. They had learned it. If you trace the history, they had learned it probably from the Persians, but they had perfected it. Well, Rome, who didn't have a law given to them by God, and so thus Peter says by lawless hands. They didn't have a law given to them by God that said you could crucify. Have crucified and put to death. But think about who he blames this on. He doesn't say, well, the Roman officials or Pilate or Herod. He says, you. He's talking to his audience. He doesn't pull any punches. He says, you crucified him. Well, like I said, we're going to get into some of this in the sermon, so I'm not going to pull out all the thinking. We'll let your thoughts run for just a few minutes. He says, whom God, verse 24, raised up, having loosed the pains of death, because it was not possible that he should be held by it. Jesus came forth out of the grave. That's simple. Jesus was resurrected. That's important. The resurrection is important. And we don't preach a lot on the resurrection. I don't, I was thinking about this here about 4 or 5 years ago, or longer than that, about 6, 7 years ago. I thought, I really don't preach a lot on the resurrection, because once you get him out of the grave, there's not a lot more you can say. But the resurrection is important, because the resurrection proves that Jesus was Christ, the anointed of God. Christ means anointed. He was God's anointed. He was the Christ. We often talk about Jesus Christ, and we think of Christ being his last name. It's not his last name. That's his title. He's the anointed of God. Jesus is his name. And so, being the anointed of God is proven by the resurrection. Jesus didn't have to have anybody stand at his grave and say, come forth. He came forth on his own. He came out of the grave. So he loosed the pains of death, because it shouldn't be holding of him. For David says concerning him, and this is a quote out of Psalm 16, I foresaw the Lord always before my face, for he's at my right hand, that I may not be shaken. Therefore, my heart rejoiced, my tongue was glad. Moreover, my flesh also will rest in hope. For you will not leave my soul in Hades, nor will you allow your holy ones to see corruption. You have made known to me the ways of life. You will make me full of joy in your presence. So he says, Lord, I saw you. And to me, these verses that Peter pulls out of Psalm 16 help show us where Jesus went after he died on the cross, and before he was resurrected, before he ascended into heaven. Where did he go? Well, in verse 27, he says, you're not going to leave my soul in Hades. What's Hades? I know some of us have discussions about that, and it's always been a point of folks not agreeing all the time on where is Hades, what is Hades. But the Hadean realm, if you go back to the rich man and Lazarus, the Hadean realm would include Abraham's bosom. It would include where Jesus told the thief, today you'll be with me in paradise. It is not heaven itself. But when Jesus ascended, he ascended into heaven itself. But he stayed some 3 days in Hades. And so what Peter is doing, think about what Peter is doing. Peter is trying to get these people to understand it's Jesus who came, who was sent by God, who did these signs and wonders and miracles, who was confirmed by God, who was crucified by you, that came forth out of the grave, that ascended into heaven. They all knew all these things. He says, he's telling the story. And this quote out of Psalm 16 is trying to bring the people in and say, look, this what happened is from divine authority. You see, think about it this way. When folks like me preach or folks teach, we'll talk for a while, and everything that is said, the thoughts at least, have come out of Scripture. But then all of a sudden there is a quote from some passage. Well, what is that quote for? It is to make sure that you understand that what you are hearing is the message of God and not of the preacher or the teacher, whoever that is. So saying, look, you knew the Psalms, you knew what David wrote. And he tells them this and he includes this. And then he goes on. Verse 29. Let me stop. Anything anybody like to say? Ask. Or just add. Great Bible students here. So he says, men and brethren, let me speak freely to you of the patriarch David, for he is both dead and buried, and his tomb is with us to this day. In other words, they knew then where the tomb of David was. We have no clue. You go take a trip in the Holy Lands. People tell me I've never taken a trip to Holy Lands, but those, you may have them say, well, but we really don't know. Archaeologists have told us we really don't know where David was buried. But they did then. Verse 30, therefore, being a prophet, and knowing that God had sworn with an oath to him at the fruit of his body, according to the flesh, he would raise up the Christ to sit on his throne. Now, I'm not going to get into a discussion right here, right now, because in a few minutes we're going to have a bell rung. But we understand, and let me just say this, and I will talk about it later, promise. The kingdom is the church. The kingdom is used, the word kingdom in the New Testament is used interchangeably with the church. And so when he talks about kingdom and sitting on the throne, the church. And notice that he said that he would raise up Christ, let him sit on his throne. Verse 31, he, foreseeing this, spoke concerning the resurrection of Christ, that his soul was not left in Hades. Once again, we have that idea. Nor did his flesh see corruption. The word corruption there means decay. His flesh didn't decay. Now, that gets us into what kind of body did Jesus have when he came forth out of the grave. I don't really know. Jim made a reference, I think it was last Sunday, and correctly so. He talked about Jesus walked through a closed door after he came out of the grave. And that's a correct statement. And so I don't know. He could be seen, he could be felt, he could be handled, because he was, but he walked through a closed door and he ascended into heaven. And the Bible doesn't mention any change from the time, say, he was upon the earth and when he ascended, that he made a change. So he had to have some kind of spiritual body. And that gets us into, well, what kind of body will we have when we die? And, sometime I do want to talk about that. But this Jesus, verse 32, was raised up, of which we are all witnesses. Therefore, being exalted to the right hand of God, and having received from the Father the promised Holy Spirit, he poured out this which you now see and hear. In other words, he's in heaven, he reigns in heaven. You're hearing exactly what you've been told. Let me get to a point here, if you don't mind. Verse 34, for David did not ascend to the heavens, but he says himself, the Lord said to my Lord, sit on my right hand till I make your enemies your footstool. Therefore, let all the house of Israel know assuredly that God has made this Jesus, whom you crucified, both Lord and Christ. There, in one verse, there's his conclusion. And his conclusion is, and this is where we're going to have to stop, but his conclusion is, and I want to come back to this next week, that Jesus was made both Lord and Christ by the Father. And that's the conclusion of Peter's sermon. And if you can't follow all of Acts 2, if you get to the conclusion, you've got it. And so this is the part that they needed to believe. This is the part that they needed to understand. And this is evidently the part that they did understand, because verse 37 says there's a reaction. And we'll talk about that next week. Anything anybody like to say or add? Well, I was hoping to get through the chapter, but I knew I couldn't do it. Too long-winded. But we will. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to try to. We're not going to just fly through it, but chapters 3 and 4 kind of go together. So we will finish up chapter 2, and because there's a lot here at the end that I want to talk about in chapter 2, we'll see how far we get. But if we get, we'll start in chapter 3 and try to put 3 and 4 together. So read 3 and 4. They, like I say, they go together real well. All right. Well, let's bow for a word of prayer. Our Father in heaven, we're thankful for this day, thankful for the blessing of it, thankful for these wonderful Bible students. We're thankful for the time we had to spend to study your word. We're thankful for Acts 2. We're thankful to understand the beginnings of the church, but we're thankful really to see the sermon and to see the life of Jesus and really what it means and the impact that it can have and does have on all of us. We ask now that you watch over us, that you bless us and keep us and hold us as we hold to you. For this is our prayer in Christ's name. Amen. Have a great week. Thank y'all. See you.